My name is Leonie Ortega, and today I'm going to dive into the disappearance of Chandra Levy. Chandra Levy was a 24-year-old who had just quit her internship at the Federal Bureau of Prisons in D.C. This is so that she could move back to California in order to walk across the stage for her graduation. But this never happened. The date was Tuesday, May 1st, 2001. This is when she was reported missing. The primary people involved in this case are her parents, Susan Levy and Robert Levy, the lead investigator, Brad Garrett, Congressman Gary Condit, the primary suspect, Ingmar Gwandik, the main prosecutor, Amanda Haynes, and the medical examiner, Jonathan Arden. The police searched Chandra's apartment to look for information on her possible last location. They found her room with no signs of forced entry. Everything looked like it was in the right place. Chandra had packed a suitcase next to her closet, and most of her personal items, including her phone, credit cards, and ID, were still in the apartment. The only things that they could tell were missing were her keys and a ring. Investigators and her family were puzzled on why Chandra would leave her apartment without these essential items. Investigators looked through her computer and found that she had researched a visit to DC's Rock Creek Park. The park had 1,754 acres, which is about 2 times the size of Central Park in New York. So this park is very big. The park is very wooded once off the path, and finding her before the seasons changed was very important because they would have to deal with thick leaves on the ground in fall and snow in the winter. Their search in the park led to no findings. The mother of Chandra Levy, Susan Levy, looked through her daughter's phone bill to look for possible clues to what happened. Susan found that Chandra had called a particular number often. This number belonged to Gary Condit. Gary Condit was a congressman and a mayor in Ceres, California. He was very liked by the public, but he was now the public's leading suspect. Up to this point, he had won every election that he had taken part in. Police never came out that he was a suspect, but investigators did get Gary to confess that he indeed was having an affair with Chandra. At the time, Gary was 53, while Chandra was 24. Susan Levy stated that she was upset with Gary for not confessing to having an affair with Chandra publicly. In the few interviews that he did have, he would deny having a relationship with Chandra. He said that he hasn't been a perfect man, but wouldn't speak on the topic out of respect for the family. When the attack of 9/11 hit, all media attention stopped, which is a valid reason for media attention to stop and to focus on something else, but it really led to the decline of people looking for Chandra. May 22nd, 2002, her body was found. That morning, the Levy family had remotely appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show in order to talk about their daughter's disappearance. Then later that afternoon, Chandra's body would be discovered. A guy named Philip Palmer found a skull on the Western Trail near Glover Road in Rock Creek Park while walking his dog. He stated to the 911 operator that, end quote, "I came across a human skull, and I've got a dog leash marking the spot." At the scene, there was one sneaker, a cassette player and cord, Chandra's shirt, and her pants. Both her shirt and pants were covered in mud, and so was her shoe. Her pants were found inside out with each pant leg tied in a knot at the bottom. Chandra's body was badly decomposed. This is because she was exposed to the elements for over a year. She was covered with leaves and had animals and bugs that aided in the decomposition. Also, the change from cold weather to warm weather sped up her decomposition. In the medical examiner's report, it shows that Chandra's skull was cracked and that she was possibly restrained with her own clothes. The chief medical examiner was Jonathan L. Arden. He concluded that it was a homicide, but he could not conclude a specific cause of death. Arden also stated that he could not confirm her time of death, but he had said her time of death is consistent with the time frame in which she disappeared. The main suspect in this case is Ingmar Gwandik. He was arrested in late 2001 for attacking 2 other women in Rock Creek Park, the same park where Chandra was found. He assaulted the first May 14th and the second July 1st. He confessed to assaulting the 2 women at knife point, and he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison in September of 2001. His release date was planned for December of 2010. The case of Chandra Levy was called until 2009 because there was no physical evidence connecting Gwandik to the murder. Fellow prison mate of Gwandik, Armando Morales, told investigators that Gwandik had confessed to him that he had killed Chandra. During this trial, the 2 women that Gwandik had previously assaulted and Morales testified. Morales testified that Gwandik confessed to him in 2006. He stated that Gwandik had grabbed her by the neck and dragged her off the trail. He also said that Gwandik stole her fanny pack. Assistant U.S. Attorneys Amanda Haynes, Fernando Compra-Amor Sanchez, and Christopher Cavan were the ones who prosecuted the case. Due to these testimonies, Gwandik was convicted of Chandra Levy's murder and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Laura E. Hankins was a public defender that looked into Gwandik's case. She worked with the Public Defender's Service for the District of Columbia. She planned to overturn this ruling. The prosecution hid who their informant was until right before the trial. This made it so that the defense could not look into the reliability of the informant. The prosecution also failed to provide the first page of Morales' original 3-page statement, along with other documents. In December of 2015, a motion to dismiss the case was filed. The defense said that Morales had told the prosecution that he had never cooperated with the authorities before. He said that he had a "don't snitch" policy. This was a lie. The prosecution did in fact confess to knowing that Morales had worked with numerous prosecutors over the years. In the past, he had exchanged his testimony for favorable accommodations in prison. Once Morales got out of prison, he was recorded by a lady named Beatty Brandel. In this recording, he said that he was plotting to ambush a man who he thought had stolen some jewelry. He had also said he was ready to execute his plan in a quote-unquote thug way. This information is important because during his testimony against Gwandik, he stated that prison had reformed him. He had turned away from his ways of being a gang member. This recording shows that this is definitely not the case, making him seem even more unreliable as an informant. Brandel stated that he had confessed to her, saying that he lied on the stand, but this statement was not found in the 7 hours of recording that she submitted to police. So the only information used in the new case was what was recorded, not the word of Brandel. The police didn't want another case of an unreliable informant. Attorney Amanda Haynes told the jury in opening statements that the dozen or so skin cells found on Levy's jogging tights were the result of contamination by poorly handled evidence. These cells did not match Gwandik, Levy, or Condit. This was the only physical evidence that they thought they had, so at this point, the case was simply circumstantial. The United States Attorney's Office in Washington concluded that it can no longer prove the murder case against Mr. Gwandik beyond a reasonable doubt. In July of 2016, Judge Robert Morin signed the order to dismiss the charges. Ingmar Guandique was released from prison and was placed into the custody of ICE. ICE stands for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE stated that due to his previous criminal convictions, that he is a threat to public safety, and he was deported back to his native country of El Salvador. Now onto my take of the case. As I mentioned earlier, the main fault for this case being overturned is the prosecution. But let's back it up to the initial investigation of Chandra's apartment and Rock Creek Park. I think that investigators did a good job of searching the apartment, but I don't think they collected all of the evidence that they should have. I feel like investigators should have looked through Chandra's phone records and not her mom. Chandra's mom was the first to call Gary Condit to see if he knew anything about her daughter's disappearance. I think that this should have been an action completed by the police. When it comes to searching the park, the area of the park is too large to be searched in a regular fashion. For example, the grid method, spiral method, or line search method. The spiral method would not work because there was not a crime scene yet. The grid and line methods would take too much time. I think the best method would be to search the areas around every path in the park, starting from the side of the park that was closest to Chandra's apartment. There was only 4 miles between Chandra's apartment and where her body was found. I also think that investigators would have found her much sooner if investigators searched this way. If she was found earlier, there would have been a great increase in DNA evidence for police to use. The police's main suspect, Guandique, could be responsible for Chandra's death, but the world may never know. The way that Guandique had attacked the 2 other women was very close to what possibly could have happened to Chandra. I think that it makes more logical sense for Guandique to have committed the murder if it was after the 2 initial attacks, but it wasn't. This is because the prosecution could argue that instead of just assaulting her, he took it a step further and tied her up and actually murdered her. But this was not the case. If Guandique murdered her first, he most likely would have murdered his next 2 victims. Now I'm going to transition into where the prosecution messed up. To start, they did not release their informant's identity until right before the case. I think that there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that it was unintentional, and the second is that they knew he was an unreliable source. When handing information over to the defense, they left out the first page of Morales' statement. I think this is because there must have been something that he said that didn't align with the evidence that they did have. In total, all of the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial. So when Morales' statement fell through, it caused the case to fall through. Here are some of the family's final thoughts. The news that Guandique's conviction was overturned was devastating to Chandra's parents. Susan had doubts that it was Guandique, but Robert was 100% convinced that Guandique was the man who murdered his daughter. Chandra's brother, Adam Levy, said that his faith in the system changed. And I think that means that it changed for the worse. Susan said that she now feels like she's back to the beginning, not knowing what happened to her daughter or who killed her daughter, now that it wasn't Guandique. Gary Condit's son also stated that he thinks Chandra's case ruined his father's chance at a political career. He said that it was a downfall after the negative media attention, which I think puts his son in a negative light because it sounds like he cares more about his father's political career than about this girl who was murdered. The case is still cold and there are no further leads that have been released to the public. Thank you for listening to my podcast. Here is a list of the references that I used in order to make this podcast.